Welcome to part 3 of our webinar series, Assessments for Young Children. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, Words and Sentences. In a previous webinar, part 2, we talked about a companion assessment, the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, Words and Gestures. My name is Allison Setti, and my contact information is on this slide. Feel free to email me with any future questions that you have or comments about today's presentation. Today I'll be describing the MacArthur Words and Sentences, talking about how to administer the assessment, and I'll give a brief overview of an opportunity for families and children who are deaf or hard of hearing to participate in a national project that's being sponsored by the University of Colorado at Boulder. The majority of our presentation today is going to talk about the interpretation and use of the results that you would get from administering the MacArthur Words and Sentences. This assessment is designed for children between 16 and 30 months of age. It can also be used with children who are older who are exhibiting language delays. In trying to determine if the assessment is appropriate for a given child, you would want to use the Words and Sentences version of the MacArthur if you're working with a girl who has between 70 and 550 words in their productive vocabulary. These could either be signs or spoken words, or some combination of the two. Or if you're working with a boy who has somewhere between 50 and 550 words in their productive vocabulary. Again, either in sign or speech. If you're working with a child who has fewer than this amount of words, then the prior level of the MacArthur Words and Gestures, would be the appropriate instrument to use. If you would like to learn more about that instrument, watch part 2 of this webinar series. That's available on this same website in a folder called Assessments for Young Children. Let's talk a little bit about what is being assessed by this MacArthur instrument. The primary function of the instrument is to look at a child's expressive vocabulary skills. In a moment, I'll show you a sample page from the assessment, but essentially the whole first part of the assessment lists a variety of different words typically used by young children by 2.5 years of age. The vocabulary section includes 680 different words, and they're divided into different semantic categories. In addition to assessing vocabulary, this instrument also looks at semantic functions. In other words, how do children use words? It also looks at the use of word endings, or grammatical markers, and the use of irregular nouns and verbs. Finally, it takes a brief look at sentence length and sentence complexity. The published version of this test is available through Brooks Publishing Company. The published version is available in both English and in Spanish. And there are separate norms for each of these languages. So not only is the instrument available written in Spanish, but the items on the instrument are actually different on the Spanish version and are based on what's linguistically and culturally appropriate for the Spanish-speaking population. Let's take a quick look at an adaptation that we've done at the University of Colorado at Boulder. At the University of Colorado at Boulder, we've adapted the MacArthur so that a sign column is available for parents to check. So parents can check for each given word whether their child says the word, whether they sign the word, or if they do some combination of the two. After the parent completes the form, the examiner can then get a feeling for the balance of the child's vocabulary in terms of the modality that they're using. Our adapted version is also available in both English and in Spanish. I'll show you a sample page from that instrument. So we can see on this sample page that next to each word we have two different bubbles. The top of the first column says, and the top of the second column says, signs. So, for example, if a child could say the word basement, the parent would check off in the says column. If they could also sign that word, they would also check off the signs column. As you can see, the words are divided into different semantic categories, with this sample page showing furniture and rooms, and outside things, and then a little bit of the places to go section. So there's a number of pages that include these 680 vocabulary words divided into various semantic categories. And then let's take a look at another page from the instrument. This is a page that's looking at sentence length and sentence complexity. In the first item, you ask the family to jot down 3 of the longest sentences that they have heard their child say or seen their child sign recently. In the level below that, you're looking at sentence complexity. And the parent is given 2 phrases or sentences and asked to choose which one sounds more like the way their child would say a given phrase. So for example, in number 1, the choices are to shoe or to shoes with a plural S at the end of shoes. And the parents to mark which one is more like what their child is saying. The second sentence is always somewhat more complex grammatically than the first sentence. If you're interested in getting a copy of the CU's adapted version of this instrument, you can feel free to send me an email request. When you give the parent this assessment instrument, there's actually written instructions on the form, and it's fine to give them the form and ask them to read the instructions. When this test was normed on a large population of families, that's how the test was administered. It was actually mailed to a variety of families. They were told to read the instructions on the form and complete it. However, you'll probably find that for some families it's helpful to supplement the written instructions by going over it verbally or by giving them some supplemental instructions in writing. And in particular, remember that very last section that we were just looking at, where the family is to pick one of 2 sentences that sounds more like how their child is currently talking. That section can be a bit confusing for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes there's words that are being used in those phrases that are not words necessarily that their child says. So for example, in that first one, it was to shoe or to shoes. Well, possibly the child isn't saying the word shoe, but that's not really important to that particular section. And so it should be made clear to the parent that what we're looking at here is whether their child's adding an S to the end of nouns or not. So whether they say to ball or to balls or to shoe or to shoes, that's not important, and it's fine if a child is substituting a noun for one of the words in the sentences. Also, sometimes parents will say, well, neither one really sounds like how my child's talking. My child's either talking in shorter sentences than that, or my child's using more words than that when they talk. And so in that instance, you'd want to explain to the family, if they're using fewer words, pick the first sentence. If they're using more words, pick the second sentence, because that's the one that's more complex. We have some written instructions available that you can give to the family if you feel it would be helpful. This handout of instructions is available on the wiki page. The URL was sent to you in the confirmation of your registration for this webinar. And you can also see the URL link up in the comments box in the chat box of this website. So on the supplemental instructions, we remind the family to make sure to fill out the top of the form, to make sure to read the instructions carefully. And then there's some other additional instructions which you can feel free to deliver to the family verbally, or again to give them this written supplement. One of the things that you do want to make clear to the family, either verbally or through the written instructions, is that when they're completing the vocabulary section and they're marking which words their child can say and which words their child can sign, that they should only be marking a word if their child says the word spontaneously. So in other words, if the only time the child uses a given word is if they hear it first and then they imitate it, that word should not be marked. The other thing to make clear to families is that it's fine if a child mispronounces a word or is not forming a sign perfectly. They should still go ahead and mark the word. So for example, if a child is saying Nana for banana or Baba for bottle, that's fine. They should go ahead and mark the word as long as it's being produced in a way that is consistent and that the family understands what the child means. Another thing you can point out to the family is that if the child is saying a word that has a similar meaning to the word on the form, they can go ahead and check the word. So for example, there's a word on the form that is soda. If the child instead uses a word like pop, that's fine. It's just a variation of the same word, and they can go ahead and mark that. Or if the child says owie instead of saying boo-boo, that's okay to mark as well. The family should also feel free to ask other people in the environment about what the words are that they feel they've heard the child say or seen the child sign. For example, if a mother is completing the form, she can feel free to give it to the father to add in any additional words that he's heard or seen, give it to the babysitter, a therapist, a teacher, etc. The other thing is you want to make sure that the family actually completes all the sections. Occasionally in a large section, a family might think, oh, I'll come back to this later. I don't have time to finish this right now. And then sometimes when they come back, they forget that they didn't do a particular page and then don't fill it out. Of course, that would result in undercrediting the child. So you want to make sure that they complete the whole form. And it's always good when you pick up the form from the family to take a quick look through it to make sure it doesn't look like they've overlooked a page inadvertently. As you're looking through the form to make sure that it's complete, another thing you might want to do is to check for any inconsistencies. So for example, if you pick up a form from a family and you see they've marked off, let's say, a large number of words, and your impression of the child is that really at this stage they're not saying or signing a whole lot of words, you'll want to sit down with the family and reconcile that. Sometimes families may misunderstand the instructions. For example, they may have forgotten that they're not supposed to mark words that the child only imitates. Occasionally, with the sign column, families are confused between a gesture and a sign, or the child pointing at something versus actually making the sign for an item. And so sometimes just clarifying the instructions allows you to deal with any inconsistencies. It also provides an opportunity for you to help the parents with their observational skills. So if the parent has indicated that the child says or signs a word, and you're not sure that that's accurate, it's a good chance to ask the family, can you give me an example of where you've seen Johnny say that word or make that sign? Sometimes through that process, the parent realizes that the child isn't actually producing a specific word, they're just getting that meaning across in some other way. When you score this particular assessment, if you give it to a child who's in the proper age range for the test, which again is from 16 to 30 months, you obtain percentile scores. So you're able to tell what percentage of children are performing more poorly than the child you're working with who are the same age. If you give it to an older child who has a language delay, you're not able to look up the percentile ranks because the percentile tables only go out to 30 months of age, but you can still obtain an age score. The way you would do this is you would look at the percentile tables and find the 50th percentile line. Follow that line across until you get to your child's raw score. So in other words, the number of words that they're able to produce. Once you find the raw score that is closest to your child's raw score on that 50th percentile line, you just follow the column straight up, and that gives you the child's age score. Let me tell you a little bit about a project that we're doing at the University of Colorado Boulder. This project is referred to as NECAP, and it stands for the National Early Childhood Assessment Project. In this project, we're assisting interested states in administering 2 developmental assessments. The one we're talking about today, the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, and also the assessment that we discussed in part 1 of this webinar series, the Minnesota Child Development Inventory. This particular project is specifically for families who have children who are either deaf or hard of hearing. For states that join the project, these 2 assessments would be done with the families within the state, and the assessments are sent to the University of Colorado at Boulder. At Boulder, we would score the assessment for you. We'd write up a report of the child's results and send this to the interventionist who completed the assessment and or the family. And then the participating states also receive an annual accountability report, which is sent to the agency's head and helps track the progress and levels of children in terms of language and overall development within a given state or agency. If there are any people attending the webinar, state or agency level administrators interested in learning more about the NECAP project, you can feel free to contact me at the email below. Let's talk now about interpreting the results that you get from the MacArthur words and sentences. One of the things you'll want to do is compare the scores that you get on the different subscales of this instrument. Typically, developing children generally show approximately equivalent scores across the different sections. However, that's not always the case in a child who has a language delay, because delays may be present in one area of language and may not be as prominent in another area of language. Another thing you're going to want to look at on this assessment is the child's use of single words relative to their use of word combinations or forming short phrases or sentences. The rule of thumb in typical language development is that by the time a child is producing at least 50 words, you expect them to start to put words together. So by the time they have a vocabulary size of 50 words, they should be beginning to say things like more cookie, daddy go. And as they acquire more and more words, the word combination should get longer and longer. One of the things you'll want to look at through the results of this assessment is the child's vocabulary size and how much word combination they're doing. Another thing that you can look at on the words and sentences version of the MacArthur is their use of irregular forms. The irregular forms, there's 2 sections that are evaluated, both nouns, so irregular plurals like men, and verbs, so irregular verbs like ran. We don't expect children to be producing irregular forms until they're about 2 years of age. And this particular section, keep in mind, is not going to be relevant to families who are using ASL, because irregular forms are not part of that language. Let's take a look at a child's summary sheet. This is a summary sheet for Nicholas, and we can see up at the top that Nicholas is currently 27 months of age, so just a little over 2 years old. This particular summary sheet would be completed for any states who are participating in the NECAP project. If you were doing this assessment on your own, you could also fill out a summary sheet similar to this, or come up with your own summary sheet that would be useful to you. So on our summary sheet, up at the top, we have the number of words that Nicholas is producing. And in his case, he is either saying or signing 115 different words. Right next to the number of words he's producing, we have the age score that's associated with that number of words. So typically, a child who's producing 115 words is going to be about 20 months of age. So remember, Nicholas is 27 months of age, and his age score for productive vocabulary is at 20 months. Just below that on the summary sheet, we've broken down the number of words that Nicholas produces in different modalities. So Nicholas is saying 10 words, but not signing them, so just saying 10 words. He's producing 35 words in sign language, but without speech. And then he has 70 words that he's both saying and signing. So for a child who's using both spoken language and sign language, or you're trying to track changes over time in the use of spoken and sign language, this breakdown can be very helpful to give you an idea of what proportion of words are spoken, what proportion are signed, and what proportion are being done in both modalities. The next thing on the summary sheet is a summary of a section from this test that talks about how children use words. Now, in this particular section, it's very nice, especially for children with language delay, because it's not looking at the child's use of grammar, it's just looking at the child's ability to talk about different things. So, for example, one question asks, is your child talking about things that happened in the past? Now, grammatically, an adult or an older child would do this by adding a past tense ed or using an irregular past tense form. But young children will begin to talk about the past without using grammar. So, for example, they may look at a photo on the computer of something that happened in the past and comment on that. So they may see a picture of a birthday party, and they might say something like, ice cream. And maybe ice cream isn't even in the picture, but there was ice cream at that particular party. So they're talking about the past, but they're not using necessarily using grammatical past tense markers. So that's what this section here is getting at. How children are using their words. What kinds of things are they talking about? Are they talking about the past? Are they talking about things that are not in their immediate environment? Are they talking about things that will happen in the future, regardless of if they're doing it with correct grammar or not? Then the second section right below that is actually looking at, are they using word endings or grammatical markers to talk about these things? Are they using the past tense ed? Are they using the possessive s? And so you can get an idea of grammar usage. And in a minute, I'll show you a table that we can look at to compare your child's results to other children the same age, so that you can get an idea of if how your child is functioning is appropriate relative to other children of the same age. Then the last two things on the summary sheet look at the child's use of irregular nouns and verbs, and they give an age score for that. And remember, that's not expected until a child is about 24 months of age. So we see that Nicholas is not doing any irregular nouns or verbs yet, and that equates to an age score of anywhere from 16 to 21 months, because it's not until 22, 23, 24 months that we really expect a child to be producing the irregular forms. And then the last question just asks if a child is starting to combine words. So in other words, to make short phrases or sentences. So if we take a look at Nicholas and try to interpret his results, Let's first look at just his age score to see if he's on track. Nicholas is actually 27 months. His vocabulary score is similar to that of a 20-month-old. So we see that he is delayed in terms of his expressive vocabulary. If we look at what modalities he's using, we see that most of his words are being produced in either sign language alone or a combination of speech with sign, with just a handful of words being spoken only. But the majority of his words, he's using both speech and sign. This is something that would be interesting to track over time, either for a family who's hoping their child will acquire more sign vocabulary or is hoping their child will make more of a transition to spoken language. And we can see by looking at this assessment over time which trend is happening with a given child. So remember, the other thing we want to look at is the size of the vocabulary and if the child is combining words. And remember, the benchmark is that by the time the child is producing about 50 words, we expect them to start putting words together. And we can see in Nicholas's case, this has happened. So he's producing well over 50 words. And if we look at the last item on the summary, we see that he is combining words, so that's good. So he's starting to make use of the words he has to form short phrases and sentences. In looking at his use of irregular nouns and verbs, we see he's functioning below what we would expect for his age. His age score was 16 to 21 months. He is not yet producing any irregular noun or verb forms, and he's already 27 months of age. We would expect by somewhere between 22 and 24 months of age that he would start using these forms. So that can help guide what sorts of things you would want to work on with him. Obviously, one of the first things we see we need to work on is to increase his overall vocabulary, because in terms of just his overall vocabulary size, it's lower than what we would hope given his chronological age. A second thing we would want to start encouraging is the use of irregular nouns and verbs, because he is not producing any of those, and that's expected by his age. So the next thing that we're going to look at are some tables that will help you interpret your child's use of talking about the past, the present, the future, and the use of the different word endings. Remember on the summary sheet, parents were checking off if their child often does that, they sometimes do it, or they're not doing it yet. And in order to know if that's appropriate for the child's age, there's a table in the manual for the MacArthur that will show us what percentage of children at each age level are doing those different skills. So let's take a look at that table right now. And again, this page is in the manual, and it also can be downloaded from the wiki website that's shown in the comment box in the chat on this website. So the top table relates to the section about how children use words. So in other words, their semantic functions. Are they talking about the past? Are they talking about the future? And these are very, very critical skills for future development of what we call theory of mind. Theory of mind is when a child is able to know that the things that they think or that they saw are not necessarily the same as the things that you're thinking or that you saw. And the ability to talk about things other than just the here and the now is critical to developing this later cognitive function. So knowing whether the child is on target for age level in terms of what different things they're able to talk about is really critical for later development. So the way that this table is set up is we have the very first column, which has a child's age in months, so their chronological age in months. Each of the next columns tells us the percentage of children at that age who are at least sometimes or often talking about the different semantic functions. So talking about the past, talking about the future. And we can see that, of course, as children get older, a higher and higher percentage of children are talking about each of these different semantic functions. So when a child is only 16 months of age, a very small percentage of children are talking about the past, only 17%. But if we go all the way down the column to the bottom, by the time a child is 30 months of age, the vast majority of children are talking about the past, with almost 94% of them talking about the past, at least sometimes, if not often. So let's go back to Nicholas. We'll take a look at how he's doing relative to these tables. So on his form, it's kind of easy because we can see, oh, he's actually talking about all of the different semantic functions. He talks about the past, the future, about absent objects, so things that are not present in the environment. He can understand that, he can produce it, and he can also talk about what they call absent owners. So for example, if there's a pair of shoes on the floor that belong to his father, but his father's not in the room, he might point to the shoes and say, Daddy. So Daddy's not in the room. That's the absent owner of the shoes that he's pointing at. So Nicholas is doing great in terms of talking about different semantic functions. And let's take a look to see, well, wow, is he really advanced for his age? Or is this, good but expected for his age range? So let's flip back to that table. So remember, Nicholas is 27 months of age. So if we look down that very first column and find 27 months and follow it across, we can see, yes, actually for all the semantic functions, at least 80% of children at that age are able to talk about the different functions. And in some cases, like the absent object, the absent owner, it's more like above 90%, 92, 95% of children are doing that. So Nicholas is on target for his age level, but not beyond his age expectations. Let's scroll down while we're on this to the second table, which looks at the use of word endings. So now we're getting into grammar. So in the first column, again, we see the child's age in months. And then each of the subsequent columns show the different grammatical endings with the percentage of children who are using those endings sometimes or often. And remember, Nicholas is 27 months. So if we follow our age column down to 27 months and look across at the different word endings, we can see there's actually somewhat of a different pattern for each of the word endings. So for the first two, the plural S and the possessive S, the majority of children at 27 months are producing that form. So in the case of the plural S, 76% of children are doing that. In the possessive S, 84%. So the vast majority of children are producing the plural S and the possessive S. However, as we move across to the progressive ing, the past tense ed, we see that really only about half, 2/3 to 1/2 of children are producing those forms. So while some children are doing those forms, there are quite a few children who still are not doing those forms. Let's take a look at Nicholas's summary and see how he was doing with word endings. So we see with the plural S, he is sometimes producing that form, but he is not yet producing the possessive S, the progressive ing, or the past tense. Remembering back to that table that we were just looking at, we know that the plural S would be expected by his age, and so would the possessive S. So for the plural S, he's on track. However, he's not producing the possessive form yet, and most children his age were. He's not yet doing the progressive ing or past tense, but that's not a lot of cause for concern, because remember, only half of kids on that table were producing the past tense form by 27 months of age. Let's take a look at another child's assessment. So this is Sarah, and Sarah is 24 months old, so exactly 2 years of age. She's producing 235 words, so essentially twice as much as Nicholas, who is a little bit older, and that gave her an age score of 22 months. So comparing her chronological age to her age score in vocabulary, she looks like she's pretty close to on target. When we look at how she's producing the different words, we see the majority of them are being produced only in speech, 200 of the words. She has no words that she's just signing, and she has 35 words that she's producing in both speech and sign. When we look at her vocabulary size relative to her ability to combine words, we see that she is producing quite a few words, pretty much on track for what she should be doing for her age, 235 words. But if we look at the bottom of her summary sheet, we see that she's only sometimes putting words together into short phrases or sentences. Recall that we expect a child to be combining words with a fair bit of frequency by the time they can say 50 different words. So the thing that strikes me with Sarah's summary is that we may not have to work a lot on her vocabulary size. That appears to be developing naturally and well. However, she needs encouragement to combine words and put words together into short phrases and sentences. And so that would probably be the focus of any speech and language intervention that was happening with her. Let's also take a look at how she's using words. So in section B, how children use words, we see that she is not talking about the past, she is not talking about the future, but she is talking about absent objects and owners. Let's take a look back at our yes-no table and see if that's appropriate for her age. So scrolling up to the top table, let's find her age in the first column. She's right about there in the middle, 24 months of age. And if we look across, we see that by 24 months of age, 80% of children are talking about the past, and 78% of children are talking about the future. Remember, those were the two areas that Sarah was not talking about yet. And so those would definitely be things that we would want to be encouraging, because the vast majority of children at her age are talking about the past and are talking about the future. She was talking about absent owners and objects, and again, the vast majority of children of her age are doing that as well, anywhere from 88% for talking about absent objects up to almost 98% for understanding absent objects. So she's on target in that regard. However, she's delayed in terms of her ability to talk about the past and the future, and that would definitely be something we'd want to be encouraging. Let's go back to her summary sheet and look at how she's doing with the grammatical word endings. The only word ending that she's producing sometimes is the progressive ing. She is not yet using the plural s, the possessive s, or the past tense. And let's take a look and see how that stacks up relative to her chronological age. So here's our table of word endings. And again, if we look about halfway down the left column, we find 24 months, and we follow it across, and we see, all right, maybe initially looking at our summary sheet, we were a little concerned that she wasn't using her word endings. But really, just a little over half of kids her age that are developing typically are using the plural S. A bit more are using the possessive S, and so that might be one of the first grammatical forms we'd want to encourage. Only about half are using the ing, which that was the one she was using. And only about a third of kids are using the past tense by 24 months of age. So that would not be something we would be concerned about that she's not doing. So in Sarah's case, looking back again at her summary sheet, if we were going to develop some language goals just from this one assessment, we would probably want to focus on word combinations, because she clearly has a large enough vocabulary size to be able to be doing that. We'd want to be working on her talking about the past and talking about the future, but not necessarily being worried whether she's using the grammatical markers that indicate the past or the future. Also looking at her irregular noun and verb use, she, like the previous child, is not using any of these yet. You'll notice that the age score is a little bit different for Sarah than for Nicholas, and that's because the normative tables are different for boys than they are for girls. At a very early age, typically girls talk more and sooner than boys do, and the norms reflect that. So we would expect that a girl would be producing the irregular forms when they're closer to 20, 21 months of age. For boys, we don't expect it till more like 22, 23 months of age. So her age score of her raw score of 0 is equating to an age score of just 16 to 19 months, and that is well below her chronological age of 24 months. So that, again, is something else we'd want to be encouraging with her, and could really be combined with the word combination goal that we would have in her situation. Let's talk about another use for the MacArthur. If you look at the normative tables and share this with a family, it helps a family to understand the magnitude of vocabulary growth that needs to occur if their child is going to stay on track with other children of the same age. If you look at the normative tables from 16 months to 30 months of age, which is the age range for this words and sentences version of the MacArthur, you'll see that each month, if you follow along the 50th percentile line, a child needs to gain an additional 37 words per month on average to stay on track. That sometimes is surprising to people, because that's more than one new word learned every single day. Not just understanding another word, but actually producing a new word every single day to stay on track. This helps set the bar for families who sometimes, if they have a child who has language delay, are satisfied when their child might be learning 10 new words a month. And of course, any progress is good progress. But families need to know that in order for their child to stay at age level or on track for age level, they really need to be their child needs to be exposed to and learning and producing quite a few new words every single month. Having these normative tables can sometimes be helpful, because often this fact is so startling that if you just tell it to a family without any sort of evidence or backup, a family might not quite take it to heart. Another use for the MacArthur assessment, if you use the CU adapted version, is that you can evaluate the kind of communication that the child is using in terms of modality. So you can look at the number of words they're signing, the number of words they're producing in spoken language, and the number of words they're producing in both. And you can see over time if a child, in terms of their modality use, is following the goals that the family has for the child. Are they learning more signs if the family wants them to be learning more signs? Are they transitioning to more spoken language if that's the goal? And you can also get a feeling for the language that is preferred by the child in terms of usage. Sometimes you may see a mismatch between what the family is hoping the child's using and what the child is actually using, which can lead you to make adjustments either in the goals or the strategies that are being used to address those goals. So this particular instrument, as well as measuring a child's current level, can look at their level over time, can look at their modality use over time, and, as I said, can provide the parent with some excellent education about typical language development. One of the things you can talk about with this instrument is why are we measuring vocabulary development, and talk about its correlation to later reading ability, later language ability, and really highlighting that this instrument is looking at vocabulary because expressive vocabulary is of very, very high importance for many other language skills and later reading skills. Another thing that you can do with the instrument is that because it's divided into different semantic categories, you can point out to the family that it's important to have more than just labels. And in a minute, I'll show you a table that you can use if you have concerns that a particular child is producing a lot of nouns or label words, but is not producing a lot of other sorts of words. And then finally, you can use the instrument and the normative tables in the manual to help set the bar for the kind of goals that you would want to have for the child in terms of their vocabulary learning over time. So let's go back to this point about the importance of having more than labels. And let's take a look at a form that you can download from the wiki and use if you're interested. This is not necessarily something you would do for every child, but it's a great extra tool to have if you're working with a family and you feel the child is very what we call noun heavy. So it has a lot of labels, a lot of nouns, but isn't saying a lot of other types of words. In other words, not doing a lot of verbs or a lot of adjectives. This can be extremely problematic when it comes time to combine words because most early word combinations are a combination of an adjective with a noun, like big dog, or a combination of a noun with a verb, like daddy go. And if all the child has are nouns, it's very difficult for them to move into word combinations. So you can see each of the semantic categories here from the MacArthur, and whether that category is a category of nouns or a category of other sorts of words. Research has shown us that a typical child will, for every 10 words that they produce that are nouns, they should be producing 3 to 6 other sorts of words. So the ratio of nouns to other words should be somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6. So most children will say more nouns than other words, but for every 10 nouns they say, they should have 3 to 6 other sorts of words that they are either saying or signing. Let's look at one of these forms that's been completed. So we can see for this particular child, we have a lot of vocabulary that's being produced in the first, let's say 12 to 14 semantic categories. The first 12 semantic categories are all noun categories. You can see on the lower categories, which are the other sorts of words, that there aren't a whole lot of words being produced. So we may have had the feeling with this child that they were one of these noun-heavy children who is not producing a sufficient number of other sorts of words other than nouns. So when we add it up, that's actually confirmed for this particular child. If we look at the bottom of this handout, we see that this child is producing 30 different other sorts of words, and 188 nouns. If you divide those two numbers, you get a ratio of 0.16. Remember, the expected ratio is between 0.3 and 0.6. So this child's ratio is well below what would be expected or desired in typical language development. So this would immediately guide us to say, let's focus less on labels with this particular child and more on descriptive words, action words, question words, helping verbs, quantifiers, etc. And that will help the child to be able to do more in terms of word combinations and sentences. Before we close today's webinar, I want to show you one more resource that the MacArthur publishers have available for us. So there's a website that you can go to, and it's listed here on this PowerPoint. It's the SCI SDSU website. I would encourage you to go to this website and play around with it and see what it has to offer. I'll just point out a couple of things that you'll find when you go to this site. At this website, you can pick an age level of a child. You can pick a particular semantic category, like let's say action words. And then when you click those databases, which is just a matter of selecting an age, selecting a semantic category, clicking go, it will bring up a table that will list all of the action words from the MacArthur and tell you the percentage of children of whatever age you clicked, let's say 24 months of age, the percentage of children at 24 months of age who can produce that given word. This is an excellent resource if you're trying to make vocabulary lists. Let's say you're working with a family, they're wanting to learn sign language, and you're needing to come up with some initial words to work with on the family. You can go to these tables and see, well, what are the words that most children are producing by the time they're the age of the child in the family that you're working with? And these would be great starting words to teach the family in sign language. It's also a great table to look at if a family says, wow, I was filling out the MacArthur and, I was coming across some words and, really do kids at, 18 months of age say these words? You can pull up this table and see and say, hey, you know what? That word, let's say church, that's not a word that very many 18-month-olds are producing. So let's not be too worried about that. But daddy, mommy, some are, of course, obvious, but some words that might not be as obvious, you can look up and say, you know what, actually by 18 months of age or 20 months of age or however old the child is, you can look up and see, you know what, actually 80% of children are using that particular word. And so it can help guide a family as to what words they want to be especially exposing their children to, what words might be later developing, what signs you might want to be teaching to a family, because a very young child would be able to use those words. And so, of course, you would want the family to be able to be exposing the children to those words. The database is available in both English and in Spanish, so you can look up either language. And the databases were created with populations of families who spoke English or children who spoke Spanish. And so they're normed on the correct population for that language. You can, again, as I said, look up a particular age level. You can look up a particular semantic category. You can look up a specific word that you might have in mind. Or another nice feature is that you can plug in and say, give me a list of words that, say, 80% of children can produce by 24 months of age. And that, again, is a great way to generate a word list that you might want to teach a family in sign language, or you might want to be extra sure that the child is being exposed to. So I encourage you to take a look at that website, see what it has to offer. It's very easy to use and was normed literally on well over 1,000 children. So very accurate and useful database. Well, this concludes today's webinar. We appreciate you participating. If you're joining us live, you can feel free to type questions into the chat box, and I'd be happy to respond to them.